Chapter 4. The Man in the Long Yellow Coat. Christmas 1823 was especially lively and colourful in the village of Montfermeil. Entertainers and traders from Paris set up their stalls in the streets, and business at the Thénardiers' inn was very good. While guests and visitors ate and drank noisily, Cosette, now 8 years old, sat in her usual place under the kitchen table. Dressed in rags, she knitted woolen stockings for Éponine and Azelma. One evening, Madame Thénardier ordered Cosette out into the cold to fetch water. The nearest water supply was halfway down the wooded hill on which Montfermeil stood, and Cosette hated fetching water, especially in the dark. Miserably, she picked up a large empty bucket that was almost as big as she was, and was walking with it to the door when Madame Thénardier stopped her. "Buy some bread on the way," she said, giving the girl some money. Cosette took the coin, put it carefully in her pocket, and left. She was cold and hungry as she dragged the bucket behind her along the crowded street, but she could not resist stopping in front of one of the stalls. It was like a palace to her, with its bright lights, shining glass, and pretty objects. But the object that most attracted Cosette's attention was a large golden-haired doll in a beautiful long pink dress. All the children in Montfermeil had gazed with wonder at this doll, but nobody in the village had enough money to buy it. Cosette gazed at the doll for several minutes, but remembering her job, she sighed and continued on her way. She had soon left the colourful lights and the happy laughter of the village behind her, and was running down the hill into the frightening darkness of the wood. Finding the stream, she bent forward and began to fill her bucket. She did not notice the coin that Madame Thénardier had given her for the bread fall out of her pocket into the water. When the bucket was full, she gripped the handle with her tiny, frozen hands and tried to pull it back up the hill. But the bucket was so heavy that after a dozen steps she had to stop for a rest. She managed a few more steps and stopped again. Her progress became slower and slower. She was almost at the end of her strength, and she was still not out of the wood. Leaning against a tree, she cried aloud, "Oh, God, help me! Please, dear God!" Suddenly, an enormous hand reached down from the sky and took the bucket of water from her. Looking up, Cosette saw a huge, white-haired man standing next to her. He looked very strange, with his tall black hat and long yellow coat. "This is a very heavy bucket for such a small child," he said gently, looking down at her from his great height. For some reason, Cosette was not afraid. There was something about his eyes, filled with a strange sadness, that she liked and trusted. She let him carry the bucket up the hill, and as they walked back towards the village, she told him everything about her life with the Thénardier. The old man listened with great interest, and asked her many questions. As they were approaching the inn, Cosette turned to him and said, "May I have the bucket now? If Madame Thénardier sees that someone has been helping me, she'll beat me." The old man gave her the bucket, and they entered the inn together. "What took you so long?" Madame Thénardier said angrily when she saw the little girl. "This gentleman wants a room for the night," Cosette said, trembling with fear, expecting to be beaten. Madame Thénardier glanced at the old man without interest. She could tell from his clothes that he probably had no money. "I'm sorry, the rooms are full," she said. "I can pay the price of a room," the old man said. 40 sous, Madame Thénardier replied, although the usual price was 20. 40 sous, the man agreed. He sat down, and Cosette, after serving him some wine, returned to her place under the table. But before she could start her knitting, she heard Madame Thénardier's angry voice demanding, "Where's the bread I told you to get?" Cosette, who had forgotten about the bread, came out from under the table. "The baker's was shut," she lied. "Well, give me back the money." Cosette felt in her pocket and suddenly went pale. The coin was not there. "I'm waiting," Madame Thénardier said threateningly. Cosette said nothing, speechless with fear as the woman raised her arm to hit her. But before she could deliver the blow, the old man, who had seen everything, interrupted her. "Madame, I've just noticed this on the floor. It must have fallen from the child's pocket." Madame Thénardier took the coin the old man held towards her and walked away. At that moment, the door opened and Éponine and Azelma appeared. They were two healthy girls, the old man noticed, dressed in warm clothes and with pink, healthy cheeks. After hugging and kissing their mother, they sat on the floor by the fire and played with a doll. Cosette, who had returned to her place under the table, looked up from her knitting and watched them sadly. A short time later the girls grew bored with their game. They left the doll on the floor and went off to play with a baby cat. Cosette, checking that no one was watching, reached out and picked up the doll. She turned her back on the room and began to play with it, hoping that no one could see what she was doing. Her happiness did not last long, however. The two girls, when they saw Cosette with their doll, ran crying to their mother. Madame Thénardier rushed across the room towards Cosette, who, afraid that she would be punished, put the doll gently on the floor and began to cry. "What's the matter?" the old man said, rising to his feet. "Can't you see?" Madame Thénardier said, red with anger. "That nasty little girl, who isn't even my own daughter, who I feed and look after out of the kindness of my heart, has been playing with my daughter's doll." "I don't understand," the old man said. "She's touched it with her dirty hands." Then, hearing Cosette crying, she turned to the little girl and shouted, "Stop that noise!" The old man left the inn, and minutes later returned with something in his hands. The beautiful doll from the stall across the road. "Here," he said softly, placing it gently on the floor in front of Cosette. "It's for you." There was a sudden silence in the room. Madame Thénardier, Éponine, and Azelma stood absolutely still. The drinkers at the other tables paused, glasses halfway to their lips, and stared with disbelief. "What kind of man is this?" they thought. "He dresses so poorly, but can afford to buy the most expensive doll in Montfermeil." The Thénardiers gave the old man their best room for the night. The next morning they gave him the bill, charging him 3 times the usual price for a meal and a bed for the night. They waited nervously while the man studied the bill carefully, expecting him to complain or cause trouble. Finally, he looked up from the bill without expression and said, "Tell me, is business good here in Montfermeil?" "Times are very hard," Madame Thénardier replied immediately. "This is a poor country. I don't know how we would manage without the occasional rich and generous traveller like yourself. We have so many expenses. That child, for instance, you've no idea how much she costs. We have our own daughters to look after. I can't afford to look after other people's children too." "What would you say," the old man said after a moment's thought, "if I offered to take the child from you?" "Oh," Madame Thénardier's face brightened. "That would be wonderful." "Just a minute," her husband said. "We love that child very much. It's true we're poor and we have bad debts, but love is more important than money." "How much do you need?" the old man asked, taking an old leather wallet from the pocket of his coat. 1,500 francs, Thénardier, who had already done his arithmetic, replied. The old man put 3 500-franc notes on the table and said, without smiling, "Now fetch Cosette." When Cosette came downstairs, the old man gave her new clothes to wear, a black woolen dress, black stockings, scarf, and shoes. Half an hour later, the people of Montfermeil saw an old man in a tall hat and long yellow coat walking along the road to Paris, hand in hand with a little girl dressed completely in black. No one knew the man, and because she was carrying an expensive doll and was no longer wearing rags, not many recognized Cosette. Cosette was leaving at last. She did not know where to or with whom. But as she held the old man's hand, she gazed wide-eyed at the sky. She had the strange but comforting feeling that she was somehow travelling closer to God. Chapter 5. Valjean and Cosette. Somewhere on the outskirts of Paris, Jean Valjean stopped outside a large ancient building with damp walls. He took a key from the pocket of his long yellow coat and opened the old wooden door. He then carried Cosette, who was sleeping in his arms, along a dark corridor and up some stairs to the room he had rented since his escape from Montreuil. There was not much furniture in the room, just an old bed, a mattress on the floor, a table, some chairs, and a lighted stove. A street lamp shone through the only window, lighting the dark interior of the room. Valjean laid Cosette on the bed without waking her. He lit a candle and sat by the bed, watching her while she slept. He felt sad that Fantine had not lived to see her child again, but happy that he had been able to rescue her child from the terrible Thénardiers. He bent and kissed the sleeping child's forehead, just as 9 months earlier he had kissed her mother's. The next morning, Cosette opened her eyes and immediately started to get out of bed. "I'm coming, madame," she yawned, blinded by the bright winter sunlight that was shining into the room. Then, as her eyes adjusted to the light, she saw the kind old face of Jean Valjean looking down at her, and she relaxed. "Of course," she cried with joy. "It's all true. I was afraid that it was just a dream." She hugged her doll and asked Valjean hundreds of questions. Finally she asked him, "Do you want me to sweep the floor?" "No," he said. "I just want you to enjoy yourself." The December days passed in great happiness for Cosette and for Jean Valjean too. For 25 years he had been alone in the world. Nothing had ever touched his heart until he had rescued Cosette. Now he discovered the greatest joy he had ever known by just standing beside her bed and looking at her innocent, trusting little face. He had discovered love. After escaping from Montreuil, Jean Valjean had taken all his money from the bank and buried it in a forest near Montfermeil. Although he was rich, he had chosen a room in a poor part of Paris where nobody would find him. His only neighbour was an old woman who did his housework and kept his stove burning. Paying her 6 months in advance, he told her that he was a ruined Spanish gentleman and that the little girl was his granddaughter. Weeks passed, and the two lived happily. Valjean gave Cosette lessons in reading and writing, and spent hours watching her as she dressed and undressed her doll. To avoid being seen, he never went out during the day. He walked for a couple of hours every evening, sometimes alone, sometimes with Cosette. He often gave money to beggars, which was unwise because he soon became known in the area as the beggar who gives money to beggars. One evening towards the end of winter, Valjean gave some money to a beggar sitting under a street lamp outside a church. The beggar raised his face and stared hard at Valjean for just a second, then quickly bowed his head. This gave Valjean a shock. Although he had only seen the beggar's face for a second, it had seemed strangely familiar. "I'm going mad," he thought as he walked home. The next evening he returned to the street lamp outside the church. The beggar was still there, in the same position, wearing the same clothes. This time Valjean spoke to him as he gave him some money. The beggar laughed and joked with him, and Valjean returned that evening a happier man. "I must have been dreaming yesterday," he laughed to himself. "But for a second there was something about the beggar's eyes that reminded me of Javert. How could I have thought such a thing? After speaking to him this evening, I can see that he doesn't look like the inspector at all." A few evenings later, while he was giving Cosette a reading lesson in his room, Valjean heard the front door of the house open and close. This was unusual. The old woman, the only other person who lived in the building, always went to bed before nightfall. Valjean signalled to Cosette to keep quiet. Someone was coming up the stairs. He blew out the candle, and just as he was kissing Cosette on the forehead, the footsteps stopped. Valjean did not move. He sat in his chair with his back to the door and held his breath. A few minutes later, having heard only silence, he turned round. A light was shining through a crack in his door. Someone with a candle was standing outside his room. Several minutes passed, and then the light disappeared. Valjean quietly lay down on the mattress on his floor, but he could not close his eyes all night. At daybreak, as he was falling asleep at last, he heard footsteps in the corridor outside his room again. Running to the door, he put his eye to the large keyhole and saw the back view of a man who was walking towards the stairs. A tall man in a long coat with a stick under his arm. Valjean's heart almost stopped beating, and he began to sweat. "Javert," he breathed to himself. Valjean spent all day making preparations to leave. It was too dangerous for him and Cosette to stay there another night. That evening he went downstairs and looked up and down the street. It seemed empty, although he could not see into the shadows behind the trees. He went back upstairs for Cosette, who was waiting for him patiently, holding her doll. "Come along," he said. "It's time to leave." Cosette took his hand and went with him down the stairs. There was a full moon, and this pleased Valjean as he moved quickly along the narrow streets. By keeping close to the walls in the shadows, he could clearly see what was happening in the light. After a while, he felt confident that he and Cosette were not being followed. But as the church bells of the city struck 11 o'clock, something made him look back. In the light of a lamp above a doorway, he saw 4 men moving along the street in his direction. He gripped Cosette's hand and began to walk more quickly. Every few minutes, he stopped in the shadows of a doorway or at the corner of the street to look back. The 4 men were still following him. He could see their faces clearly in the moonlight, and one of them belonged to Inspector Javert. By now, Cosette was exhausted. Valjean picked her up and ran with her through a confusing system of alleys until he came to a bridge. On the other side of the river, he stopped at the entrance of a high-walled alley and looked back. He could see 4 figures in the distance on the far side of the bridge. Walking more slowly now, thinking he was safe from his pursuers, Valjean followed the alley until he came to a lane that seemed to lead away from the city. He walked along this lane for a long time until, to his horror, He discovered his way blocked by a high wall. There was no way forward. But as he was turning back, he saw movements in the distance and the flash of moonlight on metal. 7 or 8 soldiers were moving slowly along the lane in his direction. Valjean looked desperately for an escape from the alley, but could see none. On one side of him was a tall building, all its doors and windows covered with metal bars. On the other side, there was a wall, higher than a tree. He would be able to climb the wall on his own, but how could he carry Cosette? Suddenly he had an idea. He ran to a nearby street light and pulled some wire from a metal box at its base. He tied one end of the wire around Cosette's waist, climbed the wall, and, with great difficulty, pulled the girl up behind him. He was only just in time. There was a tree on the other side of the wall, and Valjean carried Cosette down into its branches, just as the soldiers arrived. "He must be here," he heard Javert's voice clearly on the other side of the wall. "He can't have escaped. There's no way out." At last, the soldiers gave up their search and went back in the direction they had come. Valjean hugged Cosette tightly with relief, knowing that at last they were both safe. Chapter 6. Marius. On the night after the Battle of Waterloo, in June 1815, a robber moved quietly around the battlefield, stealing money and jewellery from the bodies of dead soldiers. He saw a hand sticking out from a pile of dead men and horses, a gold ring on its middle finger shining in the moonlight. The robber took the ring, but as he turned to leave, the hand grabbed his jacket. The robber pulled the body from the pile of bodies and saw that he had rescued a French officer. The man had a terrible wound in his head, but he was still alive. "Thank you," the officer whispered. "You've saved my life. What's your name?" "Thénardier," the robber replied. "I shall not forget that name," the officer replied. "And you must remember mine. My name's Pontmercy." Without another word, the robber took the wounded man's watch and purse and disappeared into the night. Georges Pontmercy was married with a young son. He survived the Battle of Waterloo, but unfortunately in the same year his wife died. His father-in-law, Monsieur Gillenormand, was a very wealthy man, but the two men hated each other. Monsieur Gillenormand hated everybody who liked Napoleon. He thought that Pontmercy was no better than a beggar, a penniless adventurer who only wanted his money. Pontmercy thought that Monsieur Gillenormand was an old fool. When his daughter died, Monsieur Gillenormand made Pontmercy an offer which he could not refuse. "You have no money, and I am rich," he said. "If you want to keep your son, Marius, I'll give you no money. But if you give the boy to me, and promise never to see him again, I'll look after him." Pontmercy, wanting his son to have a good life, had sadly given him to Monsieur Gillenormand, and never saw his son or father-in-law again. Marius grew up with his grandfather, and never knew his father. Monsieur Gillenormand always told him that his father had been no good, that he was a poor soldier and a drunk who had abandoned him after his mother's death. For many years Marius believed this, but when he was 17 years old, he learnt the truth. His father, a brave officer who had fought for Napoleon and nearly died at the Battle of Waterloo, had really loved him and his mother very much. Without telling his grandfather, Marius tried to contact his father, and finally discovered where he was living. He went at once to visit him, but he was too late. His father had just died. A poor man, Georges Pontmercy had left his son nothing, apart from a letter. "For my son. My life was saved at Waterloo by a sergeant. His name was Thénardier. I believe that he recently managed a small inn in the village of Montfermeil, not far from Paris. If you ever find this man, I want you to help him in any way you can." Marius returned to Paris, but continued to visit his father's grave regularly, without telling his grandfather. One day, however, his grandfather discovered what he was doing. They had a big quarrel, and Monsieur Gillenormand ordered Marius to leave his house. For the next 3 years, Marius lived in a small room in an old damp-walled building on the outskirts of Paris. The same room that Valjean and Cosette had lived in 8 years earlier. He gave up studying law and earned his living by working in a bookshop and helping to write dictionaries. He did not earn very much money, but it was enough for the rent and simple meals. He rarely bought new clothes, but he was proud of the fact that he had never been in debt. His grandfather often tried to send him money, but Marius always returned it. He hated his grandfather for the unjust, cruel way he had treated his poor father. Life was hard for him, but he never forgot the promise he had made his father, that he would find Thénardier, the man who had saved his father's life, and help him in any way he could. Marius was a handsome young man, but he was also extremely shy. When girls looked at him and smiled, he thought they were laughing at his old clothes. In fact, they were attracted by his good looks, but he was not confident enough to realize this. As a result, he had no girlfriend, but he was happy with his books. "You shouldn't stay alone all the time," his good friend Enjolras said to him. "You should get out more. Give the girls a chance. They'd be good for you, Marius. Otherwise you'll turn into a priest." Marius paid little attention to his friend and continued his quiet life of work, study, and daily walks. While walking around his part of the city, Marius had noticed an elderly man and a young girl in the Luxembourg Gardens. They always sat next to each other on the same bench. The man, who was perhaps 60, had white hair and a serious but friendly-looking face. The girl, who was aged 13 or 14, always wore the same badly-cut black dress. She was very thin, almost ugly, but Marius noticed that she had lovely blue eyes. They seemed to be father and daughter. Marius saw this couple frequently on his regular walks in the gardens, but although he was very interested in them, they seemed not to notice him at all. The girl was always talking happily, while the man said very little. He just looked at the girl from time to time with an affectionate, fatherly smile. Enjolras had often seen the couple too. "Do you know who they are?" Marius asked him one day. "I call the man Monsieur Leblanc, because of his white hair, and the girl Mademoiselle Lanois, because of her black dress," his friend replied. For almost a year, Marius saw the old man and the young girl daily in the same place at the same time. Then, for some reason, Marius stopped going to the Luxembourg Gardens. When he returned, one summer morning 6 months later, he saw the same couple sitting on the same bench. But something amazing had happened. The man was the same, but the thin, plain girl of 6 months earlier had become a beautiful young woman. Her rough black dress had been replaced by one of fine black silk. She had soft brown hair, pale, smooth skin, deep blue eyes, and a lovely smile that lit up her face like sunshine. She looked up when Marius passed for the second time, and gave him a casual glance. Marius, however, walked on, thinking of other things. For the next few days he passed the bench in the gardens without looking at her. Then one day, as he was passing, thinking about nothing in particular, the girl looked up at him, and their eyes met. A second later she looked away, and Marius walked on, but, in a strange way, He knew his life had changed. What he had experienced in that moment was not the honest, innocent gaze of a child. It was something more than that. Whatever it was, Marius sensed that after that moment, his life would never be the same. The next day, Marius returned to the Luxembourg Gardens wearing his best clothes. He walked around slowly, stopping to look at the ducks on the lake, then casually approached the bench where Mademoiselle Lanois and her father were sitting. As he walked past, he kept his eyes fixed on the girl, but she did not seem to notice him. She was talking quietly to her father, and Marius could hear the soft, exciting murmur of her voice. Without intending to, he stopped, turned round, and walked past the bench again. He felt his face go red and his heart beat loudly in his chest. He was sure this time that she had watched him as he passed. He did not go back a third time, but sat down on a bench at the opposite end of the gardens. He looked at the girl out of the corner of his eye. She seemed to fill the far end of the gardens with a kind of blue mist. Taking a deep breath, he rose and was going to pass the bench for a third time when he stopped. He suddenly realized that, in his feverish state, he had forgotten about the old man. What would he be thinking when he saw a strange young man walking backwards and forwards in front of his bench? Without another thought, Marius left the gardens and went home. He returned the next morning and sat on a bench all day, pretending to read a book, not daring to go near the bench where the girl and her father were sitting. He did the same every day for 2 weeks. Towards the end of the second week, while Marius was sitting in his usual place, he looked up from his book, and his face went pale. Something had happened at the far end of the gardens. Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter had risen from their bench and were slowly walking in his direction. Marius shut his book, opened it again, and made an effort to read. When he felt that they were near him, he looked up and saw that the girl was looking steadily at him with a soft, thoughtful gaze that made him tremble from head to foot. He gazed after her until she had disappeared from sight, then rose to his feet and walked around laughing and talking to himself. Finally, he left the gardens in the mad hope of seeing her in the street, but instead he met Enjolras, who invited him to a meal. Every day for the next month, Marius went to the Luxembourg Gardens, excited by knowing that the girl was secretly looking at him, but too shy and embarrassed to know what to do. He avoided walking directly in front of the bench, partly from shyness, partly because he did not want to attract her father's attention. Sometimes he stood for half an hour in a place where her father could not see him, looking at her and enjoying the small, secret smiles she sent him. But it seemed that Monsieur Leblanc had begun to suspect what was happening, because often, when Marius appeared, he got to his feet and walked away, taking his daughter with him. Sometimes Monsieur Leblanc took his daughter to a different bench to see if Marius would follow them. Marius failed to understand the trick, and made the mistake of doing so. Then Monsieur Leblanc became irregular in his visits, and did not always bring his daughter with him. When this happened, Marius did not stay in the gardens, which was another mistake. Marius was too much in love to think clearly. His desire for the girl was growing daily, and he dreamt of her every night. One evening, he found a handkerchief lying on the bench which Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter had just left. It was a plain, white handkerchief with the initials U.F. in one corner. Ursula. Marius said the first name that came into his head. A delicious name. He kissed the handkerchief, breathed in its perfume, wore it next to his heart by day, and kept it under his pillow at night. I can feel her whole soul in it, he told himself. In fact, the handkerchief belonged to Monsieur Leblanc and had simply fallen out of his pocket. But Marius was unaware of this. He never appeared in the Luxembourg Gardens without the handkerchief pressed to his lips or his heart. The girl could not understand his behaviour at all, and looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Such modesty," Marius sighed. Eventually, Marius was not satisfied with just knowing the girl's name. He wanted to know where she lived. He found that she lived in a small house at the quiet end of the Rue de l'Ouest. As well as the joy of seeing her in the gardens, he now had the pleasure of following her home. One evening, having followed them to the house and watched them enter, he went in after them and spoke to the concierge. The concierge, however, became suspicious, thinking that Marius was connected with the police, and refused to say anything. The following day, Monsieur Leblanc and his daughter did not come to the gardens at all. They did not come for a whole week, and Marius began to feel depressed. Every night he stood outside their house and gazed up at their lighted windows. Sometimes he saw a shadow pass in front of a lamp, and his heart beat faster. On the 8th night, there was no light in the windows. Marius waited, his heart aching with pain, until finally going home. The next day they did not go to the gardens, so again Marius went to the house as night was falling. Once again there were no lights in the windows. He knocked on the door and spoke to the concierge. "Where's the old gentleman?" he asked. "He's left." Marius felt the blood leave his face. Almost fainting, he asked in a weak voice, "When did he leave?" "Yesterday." "Where has he gone?" "I've no idea." "Did he leave an address?" The concierge then recognized Marius from the previous week. He stared fiercely at him and said, "So, it's you again. I was right. You are some kind of policeman." With those words, he slammed the door in Marius's face.